I have been friends with someone who is gay for like most of my life, one of my best friends. And I said, like, I'm queer recently, and he's like, that's our word. And I'm like, no, I'm part of that too. Please, like, just because I've been dating men doesn't mean that I've never dated a woman or people who are non-binary or like, I still am reflective of this community of which you are a part. And I want you to acknowledge me as that as well, even though maybe in your mind, me as a young person, I only dated men, so that was how you see me. It is exactly what you said. It's language. It's just how we want people to see us and understand us better. And I think that it is important because of that, but it would be really nice if nobody gave a shit too, and we just could be who we are without needing to label ourselves all the time.
Welcome to the Multiamory podcast. I'm Jace.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Dedeker.
We believe in looking to the future of relationships, not maintaining the status quo of the past.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, swinging, casually dating, or if you just do relationships differently, we see you, and we're here for you.
Forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we're answering listener questions. We will be diving into questions like, can we speak compassionately about one penis policies? What value are labels and identities? And about the fear of losing an intimate friendship when that friend gets a new romantic partner. We're going to be covering a lot of ground today, and thank you to everybody who submitted their questions. If you're interested in learning more about our fundamental communication tools that we reference on this show all the time and that some of our question askers will also reference back to us, you can check out our book, Multiamory: Essential Tools for Modern Relationships, which covers some of our most used communication tools for all types of relationships. You can find links to buy it at multiamory.com/book, or wherever fine books are sold. Also, check out the first few episodes of the podcast where we have reposted some of our most shared and most referenced episodes.
Before we get to our listener questions, we have to give our disclaimer that while we've spent a lot of time reading and studying up on healthy relationships and communication, we are not experts and we are not mind readers. Our advice is based solely on the limited information that we have sent into us, so please take it with a grain of salt, remembering that everybody's situation is unique. If you want to apply this advice to your own life, we encourage you to use your own judgment and, of course, seek professional help if it's needed. And also, these questions have been edited for time and clarity.
Here is our first question. Is there a way we can speak compassionately about OPP? Here's some context for this question. A lot of men who implement OPPs, which are one penis policies, do so out of deep fear and lack awareness of their inner mechanics that are causing this fear. When listening to the podcast and reading different content, there is a strong, understandable, blanket disapproval of OPP that looks like, no, that's messed up and you're messed up for wanting it for all of these reasons. I think it would really help to talk about what causes men to want this, where the fear comes from, how to work through it, and what needs to be unpacked. Signed, not down with OPP.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that that's their sign off, because I suppose it helps to clarify that this isn't someone who is like waving the pro OPP flag.
Yeah.
Yes, that flag we all know and love. I don't know what would be on that flag. I'm a little scared of what would be on that flag.
Just penises forever.
No. Okay, no, but pro OPP would just be one penis, right?
You're right. One.
I'm thinking one
giant
penis on a hill in the middle with like a machine gun or maybe a sword, and then
goodness.
Other penises down below running away in fear.
That's so violent.
Well, you know, that's part of the...
It's phallic and it's
part of the culture.
See, I was
that...
imagining just one penis and there were other penises, but they all have a cross out, like the no smoking signs.
Well, that's
sure.
good.
To imply there's only one of them and others may not exist. May not be allowed to exist.
Right. Now, I do want to say that I would love to change this person's name to not down with OPP, and then in parentheses, you don't know me.
Oh, you
No,
don't
you don't know me.
Okay,
Would be a
alright.
fun little addition there.
Okay, well we've established that we can speak humorously about OPPs, but
Yes.
can we speak
It's a
compassionately
penis. It's
about
funny.
OPPs? Okay, I have to say, actually, I have a story related to this, and this was
Oh.
one of my very, very, very first clients right out the gate when I first started working with people. Someone came in, it was a guy, and I mean, really the gist was he was very clear about how with his partner, he was interested in maybe starting to open up the relationship, maybe starting to explore group sex or play parties or stuff like that. But he was adamant right out the gate, like, I do not want her hooking up with other dudes, like if I'm not there in particular. I don't remember if it was just if he's not there, if he had to be included, or if it was like at all. But he was very, very adamant about that. And at that time, because this was almost 10 years ago, of course, I had I had a lot of opinions about the right and wrong ways to do non-monogamy. And that was definitely what I categorized under the wrong ways of doing non-monogamy. Anything that involved this sort of control over what genitalia your partner can have sex with or interact with or things like that. But immediately, like so early on, I was struck with that difficult position of I have my own particular stance on this and my own particular moral stance on this, but this person is not paying me for me to moralize at them and for me to tell them all the ways that they are wrong and messed up. I need to find a different way of talking about this or trying to understand this. So that's the first thing this makes me think of was when I was actually in a position where you're not just like yelling at somebody on the internet, but you're actually sitting in front of another human being who wants something or is practicing something that is very different from what you would personally choose, or that is very different from what your value system around relationships or non-monogamy is.
I do know that historically, at least in the context of a lot of the relationships that I've been in, some men tend to think of relationships with women as in your woman partner is in a relationship with another woman as not being as intense or as real, quote unquote, as if she were to enter into a relationship with a man. And I think that is just this cultural underlying narrative that gets bashed over the heads of so many people. It's kind of that uber sexualization of I'm looking at two women having sex and that's hot to me. But the idea of my partner having sex with another man makes me really insecure and makes me really fearful of what is it that I'm lacking in. So I do feel compassion for that. I understand that. I may not agree with it, but I do think that right off the bat, that's kind of what we're dealing with here, this cultural narrative that's been ingrained in so many people for so long.
I think another way that we could look at this, and this is something I remember when I was in college, is when I first started kind of reading up on masculinity and trying to understand more of it from this kind of sociological, psychological, cultural lens. Because, there would be like women's studies programs, but there wouldn't be men's studies. And so I became really fascinated with that and, tried to look up some of the authors who were writing about that. And there's not a ton of resources about it. But one of the things that came up is that in our Western culture, for men, there's this competing thing where masculinity is good and desired, and you should be masculine. That's what makes you good. That's what makes you attractive, makes you successful, all those things. And if you're not masculine, that means you're bad, you're weak, those sorts of things, right? And that's really baked into how we talk about men, how we portray men in films most of the time still, the ways that we look at these traits. And then at the same time, there's this sense that masculinity is not something that you earn and then get to keep, but rather that it's something that could be taken from you at any time. And I believe that the term that was used for it was precarious masculinity. It's like people talk about fragile masculinity and stuff like that, usually in this way of like we want to sort of denigrate what masculinity is or talk shit about it. And often I think that's a fair criticism. But I think what's interesting about this concept of precarious masculinity is it's approaching it more from this sociological point of view. Basically, the argument goes that in some cultures, which there's fewer and fewer of these, but in some cultures, there's this sense of when you go from being a boy to being a man, there's some sort of rite of passage you go through, some sort of way that you kind of earn being a man, and then you just inherently possess that. You just are that, and that's not something that can be taken away from you. In the same way, I think a lot of us think that our gender works that way, where we're like, yeah, I am this gender, that just is. But it's like when you take the more like emotional sense of what it means to be a man versus be a boy or whatever, right? That kind of masculinity, that it's something that in our culture is treated like it's hard to earn, that you have to keep working to earn it, and that it can be taken away by, you know, somebody beating you at a sport is like taking away some of your masculinity or your manness, or you being weak, or you not doing the right things, right? So there's kind of this constant fear that gets programmed into boys about masculinity is important and I could lose it, and I'm not totally sure how I earn it or how I can lose it, but I know that you can, and I've got to figure that out. And so all this to say, I think that that's another way that we could look at the one penis policy, and like, why do we see relationships that our female partners would have with other men as being more threatening than them having relationships with other women? Like, I do think there's a devaluing of female relationships, but I think there's also this sense of that this could be one of those threats to masculinity. Not that we ever think of it this way consciously, but that there could be a seed of that, of like, well, I was always told that this, and kind of owning this, claiming this, being the only one with access to this of course being a vagina in this case, that somehow is part of what my identity is based on. And if I don't have that, there's a threat to it, like an actual real existential threat.
It's the cuckolding thing, right?
And I think that's why that could be
And
a
like
kink.
not in a sexy way. Not
Well, I
in
think
a-
that's why it can be a
No,
kink,
yeah.
because it is a threat, because it is scary, right? Like a lot of kinks are based around how can I
like
embrace
risk
this
and
thing
fear
that's
and
and power and losing power. It's right there. And
Yeah.
so the thing that can make it hot for people is also the thing that makes it very threatening for, I think,
Some people.
most people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know quite where we go from there, but I do think it's a very real thing to be aware of and to consider, that it's not like the people that want that aren't someone setting out to be bad or to do a wrong thing or to hurt someone else or denigrate someone else, but that it's like so subtly coded into the way we're taught to value ourselves and other people.
Well, to try to accept this mission given to us by the question asker of speaking compassionately about it, I think we all have to set aside, maybe this is dramatic language to use, but we have to set aside our own triggers in talking about OPP, because I think this can be a very triggering and upsetting topic for a lot of people, right? Because it has roots in misogyny, patriarchy, in transphobia, honestly, in gender essentialism. Like, there's so many very deeply upsetting things that can be connected to this. And I do think that that's something that does get in the way when it turns into a fight on the internet about OPP or piling on to somebody who wants OPP, right? Is because these things are there. These are part of it. But for myself personally, if I'm able to set that aside, or at least put that on the shelf just for a second, I can zoom out and I can acknowledge that, yeah, like I have a sense of like, if I imagine a partner of mine dating somebody else, there are people that I imagine that feeling easier with versus harder with. That for me is not necessarily tied to gender, but it could be like, yeah, I imagine, I don't know, if my partner's dating someone who I perceive to be less accomplished than me, maybe that would feel easier than if my partner was dating someone who was way more accomplished than me and like super intimidating, you know, just to use an example. That like, I think we all have our stuff and baggage that we bring to a non-monogamous relationship, and that like different people that a partner chooses to date are going to bring out different insecurities, and some people are going to bring out more insecurities than others. So I can acknowledge that when it comes to the way we might feel about a partner dating, it's not necessarily an equal playing field, you know, that it's like different potential metamors are going to bring out different things. And I think that then the challenge, though, is that if I can acknowledge those fears with myself, you know, not lie to myself about that necessarily, but I maybe can't necessarily let my own fears or insecurities dictate policy in my relationship. So I can't, at least in my value system, I'm not going to go to Jace to be like, don't date anyone who's more accomplished than me. This is a one accomplishment only policy, and I'm the accomplished one. And anyone else who
even
date
measure
can't be like
that?
that.
Yeah,
well,
right.
right, that gets.
It's
I mean,
easier to measure if somebody has a penis or not.
That's true.
Presumably.
That's true. But I think you get what I'm saying, or at least the heart of what I'm saying, that I have a particular value system that doesn't want to let that dictate policy. Like, I recognize that as some of my own work to do, and maybe some of the work that I need to do in my relationship to make things feel secure and things like that. And so that's, I suppose, to try to put a button on all of this, is that I do think there's a difference between someone who is in a relationship and says, I don't want you to date anyone else with a penis, that's it, portcullis down, case closed, versus someone who can recognize, yeah, it is more challenging for me when my female partner dates someone with a penis versus when they don't. And I'm trying to work on that and figure that out. And, let's work together as a team to figure that out, acknowledging that there is a certain reality that maybe this person's insecurities are triggered in a different way. Does that make sense?
It does. And I actually think you may have really hit on something with comparing to accomplishment. Because I think we have similar things of what
I've often considered accomplishment to be like a penis, yes.
Yes, yeah, you got it. No, like if you think about, it can feel more threatening or be harder if my partner's dating someone that I view to be better than me in some way, whether that's like, oh, they're thinner than me, they're richer than me, they're taller than me, they're smarter than me, whatever it is. If that's something that we feel insecure about, or feel like, oh, this is the only thing that makes me valuable, that can feel extra threatening. And I think that to go back to compassion, that if there is this sense of masculinity is a hard, tricky thing to do, but I've been taught that it's important for me to do. And I don't quite know if I'm doing it, but other people are probably doing it better. That there's kind of this unconscious fear or competition there. I think it's also a thing that can hold men back from having close friendships and being vulnerable with each other, there is a little bit of that sense of like threat of maybe, oh, if I show that I'm less masculine, I might be kind of losing out to you, or that would then make me lose that altogether. I know I'm really coming back to this, but I think to bring the compassion piece in is that I do think the question asker is onto something here, where if someone wants a one penis policy, I want to ask the question to them of kind of, and I don't think they'd be ready to answer this right away, but it's kind of like, I just want to say, hey, you're great. Like you are awesome by yourself. Like you don't need to push anyone away in order for you to be valuable and important and cool and strong and powerful and like whatever the things are that you want to be. So I feel like that is a way to bring some compassion to it, is how can we focus on making that fear less a part of our culture and less a part of the way we treat men. And I even see feminists use language that's like very much activating that threat in trying to say, hey, we should stop doing this. And it's like, that's not a good way to make someone say, yeah, I want to stop doing this, when you're kind of threatening the only thing I've been told makes me worthwhile. So I'll get off my soapbox now. But I love this question that, yes, I think compassion is a really important thing to bring in all areas of our life. But I do think this is one that can often get left out also by us on this show.
And also anyone who's listening and is about to like angry email us that we've offered any compassion whatsoever, like, don't worry. We could record an entire episode about all the ways that OPP is inherently messed up. Like, just trust us that you're on the same page
we have
as
before.
us.
Yeah.
And we have.
And you wrote an article about it like early on in the Multiamory.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Like,
a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a good article.
And even this question asker is not in support of it, right?
It's
I do
true,
think that's
not down
important
with
to
OPP.
emphasize too, that the point here is like, yeah, just saying it's shitty and you suck for wanting it doesn't really help anyone stop wanting it or engage in a good conversation.
Yeah, so don't go out and like post that Multiamory loves OPP and flies the flag and Jace hates feminists and other misconstructions from this episode.
Yeah.
No, it's all good. It's good to have compassion for things and to stop and think, why is this prevalent? And we appreciate you for giving us the opportunity to do so.
Our next question today is, what are your views on labels and identities? Now, here's the full context. Something I've observed over the last few years is the development of many different labels and identities for sexuality, relationship style, and gender. How important are labels and identity to each of you personally? What value do you think they might have or might not have for society? Do they break apart communities and make stereotypes possible? or are they necessary in order to fight discrimination and make differences visible? Do you think we will not need them anymore at some point, or will they always be important? And this is from Philosophical Panda.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I really had a time in my life where I didn't want labels to be a part of who I was. And then I really enjoyed having and finding the label of like bisexuality, for instance, for who I am. And I do still adhere to that label. And I don't know, in terms of like the label of ambyamory or something else, I'm not quite sure what fits exactly. I think that I more adhere to a label of just I enjoy people and I'm interested in people and I'm interested in having relationships with them. And that's kind of what matters to me. But there is so much, I think, interest in labels because people find home with them. They find care within those labels and they find community, and that's really important to them. So I do think that they serve a purpose, but there's always this question of like, are we othering each other by getting these labels and adhering to these labels so specifically and strictly?
A truth that I think I've been coming around to recently is the fact that labels never entirely belong to just you, that a label or an identity is a little bit collectively held. And that can bring some really wonderful things like making it easier to access community, like, oh, I've met this person who shares the same label as I do. And so that means maybe we'll have a certain amount of kinship, or at the very least, I know what search terms to use when looking for, particular munches or meetups that I want to go to. And it can act as a shorthand. So that collectively held label can bring these really positive things, but it also can bring these drawbacks, like the fact that it does leave you subject to stereotype and it leaves you open to what everybody else's definition of that label is. That like it's never 100% under your control. And so you have to learn to tolerate a certain amount of that. I think if you want to embrace a particular label and identity, is that I think that the benefits of adopting that label or identity have to outweigh the costs for you. So actually, I've never really talked about this, but increasingly over the past few years, I've been using the word non-monogamous to describe myself and to describe my relationship practice more so than polyamorous, even though I think that in practice, polyamory is what I do and what I tend to do. For me, being in this scene and especially like creating so much content around non-monogamy and doing so many interviews and stuff like that, like polyamory I've been exposed so much to polyamory, the word being used almost like a 4-letter word, honestly, and being used as a subject of derision and, the target of stigma and stuff like that. And so for myself, it's like started to have this weird negative connotation just when I hear it to my ears. Conceptually, I'm all on board. And so it's like for myself, I find myself gravitating to non-monogamy as like maybe the safest feeling term for myself. So this is maybe just a little window into like my own psyche right now. I don't want the label of polyamory to change. Like I want people to still be using that label and adopting that identity. But for myself, I found myself just like drifting in that particular direction. And again, I think for me, it was a little bit of like this term polyamory. To me, it feels like there's some costs in the way that people misconstrue what it means, misuse the term, misapply the term. And so I just feel more comfortable saying non-monogamous rather than polyamorous. Is that weird? Does that make sense? Am I crazy?
You changed one label for another, kind of.
Well, yeah.
Even though both sort of encompass who you are.
Exactly.
Which is interesting.
It's just like a weird felt sense for me that shifted that.
I think, there's a couple interesting things. One is it reminds me of conversations we had in like our very first few episodes of this show where we encountered some people who also didn't use the word polyamory because for them it had a bad connotation. It had developed that. And to us, that was kind of new, novel. Like, wow, gosh, what do you mean? Because the term was relatively new to all of us, like within the last few years before that. I think the other factor is that as polyamory has been talked about more and there are more resources about it, there can be this feeling like the connotation and the meaning of it is maybe solidifying a bit more. and moving to using the label non-monogamy, which is less solid by its nature because it is more of this umbrella term that captures a lot of things, is what attracts you to it, because it prompts people to ask more questions because it intentionally doesn't tell them as much up front.
Yeah, maybe there's something about that, right? That like, even though chances are high that if I say polyamorous, maybe what the other person is thinking matches with what I'm saying, but there's also, I think, increasingly higher chances that maybe it doesn't, as more people have become more aware of it as a term. And then also there's more, I don't know, just people are misconstruing more, I suppose. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's something about that like I don't want to take the risk because I have a feeling that like the word that I'm using is actually not translating. I would rather use this more generic term and then have to follow it up with specific description.
In an episode that we did with Martha Kauppi, she talked about the fact that labels are like a shorthand, a way for people to make assumptions about you that you can essentially tolerate. And if a person sees you and you say the word non-monogamous, that could mean a lot of different things. It kind of encompasses the whole breadth of whatever non-monogamy is. But polyamory, I think there's like a certain kind of flavor or maybe quote unquote type of person, and this is stereotypical and not necessarily at all true, but somebody may jump to a different like viewpoint of what that type of person is, for example.
Or what that type of relationship is.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Because for all I know, this person I'm talking to has read 600 news articles that are just about the white throuple, and that's what they think polyamory is.
Exactly. Or that you're some influential, coastal type, which I suppose
I am an
kind
influential
of are.
coastal type. But
That's not
accurate,
wrong, but here we are.
Sure. No, I do think that part of what's underneath that is that as the term is being used more, it's not maybe that the meaning of it is solidifying, but that it's more likely you'll encounter a person who thinks they know for sure what that means when they might not know what it means to you.
Yeah.
That maybe we're in a little bit of this in-between phase where it's not super well defined. And I think in general, the community, myself at least, like it that way. Like it shouldn't be this fully locked down. It has to look exactly like this. But I think the wider public might think they know what it means because they read one news article about it. And so they're like, yeah, I know what that is. So that kind of makes me think of another situation where for myself, I feel like I'm constantly doing a little bit of this mental work when talking to people in choosing which label to use when it comes to bisexual versus pansexual versus queer. And I feel like there's this moment every time if that subject comes up where I kind of have to make this judgment call of which set of like connotations and assumptions do I think will most accurately communicate what I'm trying to communicate in this situation. Because ultimately, I think the label is there to help us communicate, not for us to kind of be the slave to those labels and to just, try to follow exactly precisely what they are. And I think the scientists out there, the academic writers might struggle with that because that's so focused on we have to define terms very clearly. But I think that's a different kind of context than what we're talking about here. Where like with bisexual, I can say that and I know that everybody, no matter kind of where they lie on their understanding of sexuality and gender and whatever, gets a basic sense of what that means. In another context, though, I might judge that, well, I think pansexual might help clarify for this particular audience who understands or might think more about this distinction that I don't mean that to say I believe in a gender binary. And so in a different context, I might use that label instead because I think it's going to help communicate more information more clearly.
Sounds like a tiny bit of code switching.
Yeah, I'd say code switching is part of that. And then using queer is kind of like, for me, using the non-monogamy label.
Yeah, I like
using it. This is, I like it because it doesn't have as much meaning. And so there's this kind of like, we're going to have to talk about that more if you want to. And if you don't, all you have to know is it's just not the heteronormative thing that you may have assumed about me, because I think most people just assume that out the gate about everybody, unless they have clear signs otherwise.
It's funny. I have been friends with someone who is gay for like most of my life, one of my best friends. And, I said like I'm queer recently and he's like, that's our word. And I'm like, No, I'm part of that too. Please, like,
Yeah.
just because I've been dating men doesn't mean that I've never dated a woman or people who are non-binary or like I still, am reflective of this community of which you are a part. And I want you to acknowledge me as that as well, even though maybe in your mind, like me as a young person, I only dated men, so that was how you see me. But it's not who I am and have become and always have been. So it is interesting. It is exactly what you said. It's language. It's just how we want people to see us and understand us better. And I think that it is important because of that, but it would be really nice if nobody gave a shit too, and we just could be who we are without needing to label ourselves all the time. But it's helpful, at least. It's helpful to let people know where they stand with us and where we stand with them.
I want to quote or at least reference a writer. I always feel awkward referencing this writer because his real name is Dinty Moore, like the canned beef stew.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
I'm not aware of this
Dinty
stew.
He's
Maybe
an-
because I'm vegan.
Dinty Moore is
Dinty
like
Moore.
what your grandma would have gotten. It's like old school
canned
Yeah.
beef stew. But anyway, this is his name. An amazing essayist and writer. He writes a lot about writing in particular. He was very inspirational to me anytime that I've been doing writing or working on a book or things like that. But at one point, he talked about the process of writing and like working with this imperfect medium of language and how when we're writing and trying to put words into an idea, it's like we have a bucket full of minnows that we're trying to grasp with our bare hands. So it's like all of these concepts and identities are slippery and fast, like little minnows. And we're attempting to use this really imperfect tool to try to keep it in one spot. And so a label it's the best that we got sometimes. And we try our best with it. And also it's like, it's going to slip away and it's going to change. And I don't know, I think we just kind of roll with the punches. So I suppose it comes back to that theme of maybe for myself, it's been this journey of trying to not grasp so incredibly tightly to labels, maybe as much as I once used to.
So I don't know if we fully answered the question of whether we think labels will always be necessary or not. I tend to come down on the pragmatic side of, I think
as long as we have language and that's how we communicate with each other,
probably.
of course.
language is labels in a way.
Yes.
So there's really no getting around it completely. But I do like it when you're able to be in certain communities where certain labels don't have to be used as much or become less meaningful, I guess, right? Like if I'm at a queer meetup, using the label queer becomes less meaningful. And that's kind of nice because it's like, that's now just the normal versus in other kind of more public type settings where it's like, no, that is an important label because the assumption is you're not, because you're just a person in the world. So I do think that's an interesting aspect too of like, when does a label become more or less meaningful based on how unique it is in the context?
Did that philosopher maybe make the stew?
He was a writer, not a philosopher.
Oh.
No, but if you're writing, I highly recommend checking out The Mindful Writer by Dinty Moore. And if you're not vegan, maybe enjoy some Dinty Moore stew while you're reading it.
We have one more question to get to today, but we're going to take another quick break to talk about a couple sponsors of the show. We really appreciate so much that these companies are willing to help sponsor this show. Not all companies are comfortable with our show because we're too weird and too outside the normal, or we're part of too many labels.
It's because of our labels, exactly.
And the last question for this episode: how do I deal with the worry that an intimate friendship will change when my friend gets a romantic partner? I dated someone for 3 months, and then we de-escalated to a friendship as he wasn't in a commitment space and I was. We've kept some elements of physical intimacy, just stuff like I'll stroke his hair or we'll have a cuddle on the sofa. He started dating again, and I'm worried that he won't want or need that anymore as he'll have another source of intimacy. I'm single and dating on and off, and so he's been my constant in that sense. And that is from Bothered in Bristol. And they did write in parentheses UK. And at first I was like, well, obviously Bristol's in the UK. But then I Googled it and I was like, oh no, there's like 10 cities in the US called Bristol. So
Wow.
Thank you for clarifying.
But we could all tell it was the UK because
A cuddle on the sofa.
have a
That's
cuddle
how I know.
instead of to cuddle.
Oh,
on
is that
sofa.
is that the giveaway?
Have a cuddle.
To
That
have
was
a
the
cuddle? I
giveaway.
suppose so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cute.
Yes.
Love it. Yeah, this is tough.
Ugh, boy. I guess I would have some follow-up questions around the de-escalation, right? Because I suppose that feels important to me, because I think that you can have a de-escalation like this where you're dating, this person's not ready to commit, and so you decide to be friends, where one version of that maybe could be really healthy. Maybe you both come to the conclusion, yeah, you know what, you're right. Like, let's be very relationship anarchy smorgasbord about this. Let's figure out what are the things we still want to have on the table. What are the things we don't want to have on the table? So cool, can be mutually co-created. And there also could be a version of this where we de-escalate. One person doesn't want to commit to the relationship right now, but the other person hangs on to like literally whatever crumbs they can get because they're sad about losing the relationship. I think this is where I've seen people who've broken up, but they're still like, well, let's still cuddle, or let's still keep having sex, or let's still keep texting each other every single day. And it's not necessarily because that's the best thing for the relationship at that moment. It's because people are afraid of the change and not having this particular channel, right? And it's unclear from the question asker's context that they gave, but I guess that's where my brain goes first.
That's interesting. That's not where my brain went right away, but it does make sense that I've been in that type of situation before. So yeah, there could be some of that going on. I guess it just would have felt like we would have seen a little more of that desire kind of leak through in the question, so to speak, if that were the case. But I'm also reading between the lines a lot because we only got this one paragraph here. Yeah. So who knows? It does make me wonder if this is a relationship where you could have that conversation. Looking at the smorgasbord and saying, you know, what do we have in this relationship that we like? And is it okay for us to keep that? Granted, that can be hard, especially depending on like if this person's monogamous. It might be harder if they start dating someone, or even if they want to maintain that relationship with you, the person they're dating might feel threatened by that and have a hard time. But if they're non-monogamous, there's probably more likelihood that that other person would get it and be more comfortable with that. But it does make me wonder if that is something that you could just talk about more explicitly, even if the result of that is understanding from them that they're kind of like, yeah, I could take it or leave it with this relationship. At least that would be clear, even if it's not the answer you'd want.
I did wonder if this was a monogamous kind of configuration, and that at the moment, the intimacy, at least the physical intimacy, is occurring because there is a promise or a hope of another monogamous type relationship eventually that is going to transfer those sort of more physically intimate things that you're doing in this one now to that one. Clearly, many people can get physical intimacy from both friendships and from romantic relationships. That is absolutely possible. But there's always a potential of another partner, especially in a monogamous type setting, not wanting that to be the case, for example. And that is a thing that perhaps you have to worry about or think about at the very least. As Jace and Dedeker said, bring up to this person that, hey, I would love this to be a thing in our lives, in our friendship, that we have the ability to do this because it's really important to me and it feels like it's important to you as well. What are the things that potentially could make that not happen anymore? And is that something that I need to worry about? Is that a potential thing that I need to start divesting myself of because I'm doing that in preparation for the inevitable when you are eventually going to find someone and then transfer all of these lovely parts of our relationship to them?
I think what's hard though, I mean, because I'm on the same page with both of you that like if the channel is open in this relationship to just have an open conversation about this, that people should. I do think it's hard though, because I don't think a lot of people are willing to admit something like, no, I'm not actually interested in keeping this relationship around, but I'm scared that if I tell you that, then I'm going to lose my access to like nice cuddles in the meantime before I found another partner. And not even that like people don't want to say that because it sounds bad, because it does. But also sometimes people haven't even thought that far necessarily. And sometimes we can kind of bury the things that we want under a lot of layers of justification or denial or obfuscation. And so like that could complicate this as well, as like if this person hasn't quite done some of that self-reflection around what the goal is for them here or what the purpose is for them here in staying connected, or maybe what their own value system is around having this type of friendship, that it could be hard to, I don't know, I guess have a very clear conversation about what's going on.
Now, this is going to sound weird because, on this show, we're always such advocates for clear verbal communication about things wherever possible. But I do think for the question asker, if you feel like, I don't know if that's a conversation that I could have, or you have that situation where, yeah, we talked about it, and I just don't know for sure that he's being honest with himself even, or that he really knows, I'm not sure. Some things that come to mind of just what to look for when evaluating this is when you spend this time together, who's initiating this kind of connection, right? You mentioned you stroking his hair. Does that ever go the other way around? Is it kind of both of you initiating cuddles equally? What about the hanging out itself? Is that feeling one-sided or both-sided? That might at least give you some clues of, okay, am I holding on to something that I want, but this person really isn't as much? Or is this, yeah, okay, there's something here that doesn't mean a new relationship won't complicate that, but at least I can get a sense of, yeah, no, there's definitely something valuable in this that both of us seek out. So I always am cautious of trying to read too much between the lines, but I do think it helps you to get some data and to kind of help understand what might be informing your feelings. Is this a fear purely practical? Because, yeah, when people date people, they often stop hanging out with their friends as much, or that person might be threatened by me. Or is this coming from a place of, there's part of my subconscious that's already feeling like this is tenuous and not very secure, and so that's why I'm feeling this feeling. That might at least help give you some data to evaluate that, even though it's not perfect.
Well, here's something that I think I can feel pretty confident in extracting from the information that we have here, which is that there's an attachment here. That there's something about this relationship that has tipped over into that sense of attachment. I think anytime there's a sense of stakes, there's a fear of losing somebody, there's some kind of attachment that's there. And again, we don't just have attachment with romantic and sexual relationships. We can have attachment with our friends, with our parents, with our children, with anybody really. And so I do think, again, if this is a conversation that could be had, really, I think it boils down to like, is this other person on the same page that like, yeah, this is an attachment between the two of us that we want to care for in some way, and that we want to keep negotiating what that attachment looks like and how we make each other feel secure and good in this attachment? Or is the other person not on the same page? Like, are they not interested in caring for an attachment-based connection? Maybe that's me trying to oversimplify it, but I feel like that's maybe the crux of it.
No, I do worry that it is just, it feels good right now, so I'm going to do it for the other person. Not that there's any evidence to that necessarily, but that's where my head went initially. It was like, well, I don't know what this person is going to do ultimately, because it seems like the one who is invested is the question asker, and they're worried about this. And so, yeah, I think absolutely getting on the same page, or realizing there isn't going to be a same page, and therefore I got to figure that out.
Or even if you do get on the same page, evaluating, can you tolerate, or like, are the benefits of this connection going to be worth the potential pain when this person does commit to somebody else, right? Like when it's a situation of like, oh, they weren't ready to commit to you, but now they're ready to commit to somebody else. And even if you're on the same page about what type of connection you want to have, that could still freaking suck.
Oh,
you know, I feel like it'd be really hard to not experience feelings of rejection in that situation.
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, because I do have a friend who we started off by, I guess, going on a couple dates. And then I was in a place of, I don't think I really want to be dating right now. Let's have this be more of a friendship. And now it's become a really great friendship. And now as I do think about, yeah, maybe I'd want to date again, I do have a little fear of her feeling slighted by that, or feeling like, oh, well, was that not true before? And it's kind of more like, well, this relationship now occupies this very different and still very important place for me. And so I don't want to try to make it into this other thing that I thought it was going to be at first. And it is a bit tricky. So there's definitely stuff to talk about and explore there. And it can be difficult to communicate about no matter what. Even if both people come in with the best intentions, it's a hard thing to evaluate because we don't have a lot of, I guess, examples of how to think about friendships and relationships in a more, how do I say, like proactive, clear kind of way, like an intentional way that we don't have a lot of examples. And so it can feel a little bit like we're trying to pave the way that no one has gone before, even though they have. It's just harder to find those examples.
Well, Bothered in Bristol, thank you so much for writing in, and we wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you to all of our question askers for this week's episode. Bothered in Bristol, Philosophical Panda, and Not Down with OPP, You Don't Know Me. Thank you all for submitting your questions.
Now, folks who are listening, we want to hear from you. If you go to our Instagram at multiamory_podcast, look at our Instagram stories, and this is our question this week. What is one label that you wish you could throw in the garbage? Again, go to at multiamory_podcast on Instagram. Also, the best place to share your thoughts on this episode with other listeners is in the episode discussion channel in our Discord server, or you can post about it in our private Facebook group. You can get access to these groups and join our exclusive community by going to multiamory.com/join. In addition, you can share with us publicly on Instagram at multiamory_podcast. Multiamory is created and produced by Jace Lindgren, Emily Matlack, and me, Dedeker Winston. Our production assistants are Rachel Shenawork and Carson Collins. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.